2011, how their experiences have gone on to shape student activism that's taken place on campuses in the intervening 3 years. Because I think everybody would agree that the student movement today is not the same as it was in 2010, sort of numerically or politically. We are seeing the continuing imposition of neoliberal policies and austerity in universities, privatisation, marketisation, and so there is a need, obviously, to resist these things. So I want to talk a bit about potential for doing things once again on a national scale around the higher education strikes, the first of which we saw 3 weeks ago, and sort of things about student loan privatisation. I'm only really going to talk about Britain, but I think it's obviously important to note that the student movements over the recent period have included those beyond Britain, particularly in Quebec and Chile, and wider movements globally, the kind of things that Mark talked about. So I guess we've got more time to discuss them later. I think it's useful sort of to start with thinking about the way that students have changed over the last, few decades. I think we've seen a massive growth in the number of people participating in higher and further education. NUS now represents over 7 million students, whereas the number of students in sort of the 60s and 70s, when we sort of saw the exposure to students then, was much, much smaller, although obviously we've seen a growth in that period from sort of much, much smaller numbers before. And I think we have to see students representing a large and distinct force in society, but the question is what kind of force is this? What place do students have in society? And I think I'd argue that it's a transitionary phase and somewhat ambiguous. So students don't have a direct relation to the means of production. They're not exploited in the way that workers do, although many students also do work. I think that's something that I'm not going to talk about it here, but I think that's a wider question that would be useful to develop further. But at the same time, being trained to work in most cases, and the expectation you will go to work after being a student, and the experience of alienation, being a student of things like exams, debt, more housing and things like that. And there's also an element that people enter university expecting it to be a space where you can think critically about the world around you, that it will be a democratic space, but the reality is that people's places are often very different. And while it doesn't automatically lead to struggle, when it does, it sometimes can, and when it does so, it often does quite explosively. I think there is also the thing that universities tend to be quite a more political space than society more generally. It's like we're having this conference now, there's a space to talk about political ideas and things like that. And the experience of historical student struggles, I think, shows that things can often be things outside the universities that spark struggle among students. So in 1964 in Berkeley, you see it was off campus campaigns against segregation that sparked off the student movement there. And even in Britain around LSE in the 60s, there was it was around somebody who was part of the racist regime in Rhodesia being appointed as the director that sort of sparked some things there. And even more recently, if you think about in 2009, something I'm going to come back to later, we see occupations in universities and demands being placed on universities over the bombing of Gaza. And we also see that the way the university authorities and police react against activism in universities. For example, there's just a thing in this afternoon we put on the Guardian website about the police, Cambridgeshire police, trying to recruit and pay a student activist in Cambridge to spy on the rest of the student activists in Cambridge. They decided to secretly record it and send it to the Guardian instead. But that can spark more general and political struggles that, from something that sort of analysis like the state and the way that society is run, that can start out as being something quite specific over education, so like fees in 2010. And it's also a thing that students are less constrained by failures in the past, so that and can be more optimistic that sort of trying to change the world is possible. This is a good thing, but I think it can also sometimes mean that lessons that have been learned by previous generations of people and students aren't necessarily carried through. There's a high turnover in things, and I can often see that lessons are having to repeatedly be learned and learned and learned again. But therefore I think it's a good idea to sort of think about the experience of past movements and what we can learn from the distance, so but within the broader framework of trying to restructure education with the Brown Review, closing the market into university today. And what we saw in 2010 was for the first time large-scale struggle on specific student questions. There had been a broader radicalisation about different things before then, but for example, in 2006, so like when I started university in 2006, and that, to understand that, we have to understand the relationship between NUS, the relationship between NUS and the Labour Party and things like that. That is different when they're trying to oppose tourism and they're more likely to act, I think, on that. And I think what we saw in 2010 was good to be able to talk about students here doing something, that we didn't have to sort of be looking enviously over to like Greece or France or sort of saying, oh look, students can be radical, there's students here doing something. And that was a good audience to look back sort of 40 years to sort of try and do things like that. And I think the student movement in 2010 showed for a new generation of students that the explosive power of students, things can seem relatively stable and then suddenly they can kick off. But I think also seen the limitations of that power. I think also in 2010, beyond the student world, it plays an important role in kicking off a wider fight against austerity. So we see, like with this after the student movement, student unions beginning to take up action, which culminating in 30th November 2011 sort of, public acceptance strike. And that strike itself being marked by lots of students on the picket lines and visiting them. I think 2010 tells us an important thing around the relationship between the official and unofficial student movement. So by official, mainly in 2009 was maybe around about 700. And so it would probably have been much, much smaller without NUS. And so without NUS mobilising, we probably wouldn't have seen the events in Milbank. But the events in Milbank wouldn't have happened without there being activists who were willing to break with NUS officially where necessary. And so I think it highlights the importance of working with and against sort of the NUS leadership, of having the importance of having unofficial networks outside of NUS, not as an alternative, but as a network to NUS, but as an alternative to mean that that things can change, that we can spark off stuff where it's necessary. And I think if we look at sort of the NUS demo in 2012, it was much weaker and much smaller, partly because NUS didn't build it in the same way, but also I think we sort of see the framework of the workers' action in August from 2012 wasn't the same as the sort of after the pension sellout in 2011, and this took momentum out of the national fight against austerity. And so, but yeah, I think we can also learn. I think also so what happened in 2010. We sort of see student movement going up very quickly, but also dissipating quickly. And I think it highlights the need for things that have been sustained to become broader and deeper quite quickly. Because the nature of student protest means that they can be led by militant minorities, allowing us to explode. But then the pressures of universities, exams and things, can mean that people stay in their rooms and go and revise rather than sort of coming out onto the streets again. And so it means that people don't necessarily stick together. So I think the slogan that's Van Dine looks like a rocket down like a stick. Worker struggles, I think, have different tensions. There is more of a need to have collective action. Militant workers can't just go off on their own. They need to develop broader lists to begin with. But once you've got that struggle, there is more potential for things to sort of stick together in a longer term. So I think, yeah, there's the need to sort of get things broader and deeper, because it's unlikely that students will be able to win on their own, and I think they can win on their own. But then that needs to happen before sort of student movement dissipates clearly. And I think that's where unofficial networks can be quite important in trying to sort of broaden things out, because those links, perhaps within those, exist to draw in other forces. I think one of the key things that we saw in 2010 was getting workers to show support, to show support to students. So in Cambridge, for instance, where we had a 11-day occupation, there was lots of trade unionists sending like donations of food and money from their branches and things like union branches and things like that. When the university manager tried to use the firefighters to get the occupation stopped from using fire regulations, the sort of firefighters, FBU members sort of came and gave us useful advice about having large piles of paper is not very safe, but were very clear that they supported our occupation and weren't going to sort of play the the role that management wanted them to play. And we had sort of a general assembly of around 300 people which drew in students and trade unionists there. In Manchester, people paid for the coaches for people to go to the 9th of December demonstration. And I think this partly is because most workers will have some, either their own children or relatives in higher and further education now. And so there is this very real link to sort of what the student movement is doing. It's not something sort of is separate, because people, it's something that you might have to be. So when you see students being beaten up by the police, you can imagine it's your own children or your own relatives. And I think there was also I think a sense that it was really good that somebody was doing something around the imposition of austerity. And I think while the student movement has largely gone down from its height when workers began to take action, I think students remembering the solidarity they received from workers received sort of students in March 2011 when UCU sort of take strike action with sort of we support our lecturer signs, an organisation like flying picket, sort of solidarity pickets to visit lots of picket lines in June and November 2011. And I think it's not automatic that that sort of thing will happen. It required, I think, to support that students sort of saw the importance of workers. And I think having the unofficial networks that already existed to raise those sorts of political slogans around students and workers uniting and fighting was quite important. But also I think a legacy of students in 2008 and 2009 around the strikes that happened then, around teachers and civil servants and postal workers visiting picket lines. But there was already some sense that that was a thing that we should do. And I think the thing to learn is that to win the political argument sorts of these things does require some level of organisation to make it happen. It's not just something that will happen automatically, and I think that's where unofficial networks and things come in quite importantly. I think the student movement in 2010 also sort of has led to wider political experiences. So I think I don't think many people will now ever trust the Dems for anything. And I think it's interesting that feeds into sort of scepticism about so on the issue of student loan privatisation, they said, oh, it'll all be fine, well, we won't do anything bad. But there's a great, understandably and correctly, a great deal of scepticism about this, because what do their pledges mean? And I think it led to a new generation of people learning not to trust the government and things like that. I think concretely it's also tied in with people understanding the role of the police and the state, seeing the way that they brutally came down on people on demos. So, for example, after Meadows needing emergency brain surgery,